Hello and welcome to the CACFP Financial Management Training for Non-School Food Authority Center-based sponsors. This training has information for sponsors who do not operate school nutrition programs, such as the National School Lunch Program or School Breakfast Program. This training is presented by the Oregon Department of Education Child Nutrition Programs, also known as ODE-CNP. Before we get started with this training, we want to provide a disclaimer, which is that ODE-CNP staff are not financial auditors, and we cannot give official financial counsel. This means we can't tell you if your finances are set up correctly or not. We are here to provide technical assistance related to CACFP, and we can provide you with information on whether you meet CACFP financial management requirements based on federal regulations. This training includes a companion workbook called the CACFP Financial Management Workbook, which we will also call the workbook in this training. This is an optional tool for sponsors to use, and the link to this workbook is also available in the description section below. Throughout our training, there will be page numbers provided on an orange tear-shaped icon like the one shown on the screen. This will correspond to a page on the workbook with the same information, and sometimes spaces for you to write down information or check off boxes that are relevant to your organization. Sponsors are not required to complete the workbook, but are encouraged to use the workbook to better understand their CACFP financial management requirements. To get the most out of this training, follow along on your workbook. In this training, we will go through the learning objectives, then go through the information that's in the workbook by starting with Financial Management 101, then Performance Standards for the CACFP, then learning about nonprofit food service, and then applying that knowledge to your organization. This section is further divided into looking at the big picture, how you can determine nonprofit food service or NPFS, how you create a budget, and then figuring out how to complete your management plan and financial management procedures. Once you are done with trainings, we hope that you will have a comprehensive understanding of how financial management is implemented and tracked in CACFP, and that you will be able to create or update the financial management procedure for your organization that meets all CACFP requirements to maintain nonprofit food service program operations, which sponsors can do by keeping a nonprofit food service account. Financial management for the CACFP can seem intimidating, but ultimately it is about understanding the purpose of CACFP, which is that sponsors receive CACFP funding as reimbursements on costs incurred to serve nutritious and creditable meals or snacks that are served under the program. Funds are used solely for the operation or improvement of the food service. The reimbursements that are received must then be used to serve nutritious meals for participants. Reimbursements received cannot be used for any other purposes. No additional reimbursements are available for costs exceeding the reimbursement, and CACFP reimbursements are meant to subsidize the total food service cost. Note that the information on this slide can also be found on the workbook on page 9. Look for the tear-shaped icon on the top right throughout this training to follow along on the workbook. And because this is CACFP and we always require some form of documentation, you will need to show that you are using the reimbursements for the intended and approved purpose by providing ODE-CNP with an annual budget. In addition, and this is new, a 1-month review of financial records. We will look into both of these requirements a little more closely. Let's start with the budget. Most sponsors will be familiar with annual budgets since all multi-site non-school food authority sponsors are currently required to submit an annual budget each year. Starting this upcoming CACFP renewal period, all non-school food authority sponsors, including single-site sponsors, will need to submit a budget each year. This is because of new program integrity rules from USDA requiring enhanced oversight of financial management practices. ODE-CMP sent out the memo on the USDA Child Nutrition Program Integrity Final Rule in August of 2023. If you are one of the sponsors who doesn't know where to start with a budget, know that your organization has completed a budget for CACFP at least once before as a new applicant. ODE-CMP can provide a copy of the last approved budget as a reference. Also, by the end of this training, you will have a better idea of what you will need in your budget. Keep in mind that budgets are intended to reflect projected CACFP income and expenses for the upcoming fiscal year. The 1-month review of financial records is also new and will be required for all sponsors. While ODE-CMP does not have a definite start date to implement this, USDA is requiring state agencies to have a procedure as of August 23, 2024, and ODE-CMP is planning to start full implementation in fiscal year 2025. ODE-CMP is requesting further guidance from USDA, and we will provide additional training prior to implementation. In general, the 1-month review of financial records will include ODE-CMP staff reaching out to sponsors once a year to request receipts and documentation for all income and expenses in the nonprofit food service account in order to verify CACFP transactions from purchase to payment. If you have gone through an administrative review before, this will include the same financial documentation that is looked at during a review. So don't think of this as a requirement for sponsors to collect new documentation. The new requirement is simply that ODE-CMP will be required to review the documentation that you are already keeping at least once a year. When we talk about looking at financial documentation from purchase to payment, it means we are looking at documents showing that approved expenses were purchased, such as food receipts, timesheets, utility bills, and mileage logs. Then, for the payment portion, the sponsors are paying these expenses with credit cards, checks, and ACH transactions. And finally, we follow that payment to the bank account where bank statements show that credit cards and invoices were paid. When we look at financial records, we won't be looking at every single expense that you have for your organization. Instead, we are only looking at expenses that are charged to your CACFP fund account. For sponsors who use CACFP funds for purchasing food only, this means that we will only look at food receipts, credit card statements if you used a credit card, a bank statement showing that the credit cards were paid off, and any profit and loss reports or other account balance reports showing a CACFP fund account balance. This is what we mean when we say we are looking from purchase to payment. We are tracking it through from when you buy an item or incur a cost to when the payment is made from your bank account. Why does ODE-CMP need to review all of these documents? The reason is to ensure program integrity. We want to make sure that you are using the reimbursements for CACFP purposes. This is spelled out under the CACFP performance standards under the CACFP regulations in 7 CFR 226.6 B118. You may know them better as VCA. They stand for Financial Viability, Administrative Capability, and Program Accountability. These performance standards cover a lot of ground, but the ones that connect to financial management most are financial viability and program accountability. Under financial viability, It spells out that sponsors must spend CACFP funds appropriately and account for them, and that sponsors must demonstrate there are adequate financial resources to operate CACFP on a daily basis. This is to ensure continuous operations of CACFP. All costs must be specified in the annual budget, and they must be necessary to run the program, reasonable in cost, allowable for the program, and appropriately documented. Under program accountability, sponsors must show they are accountable by having written financial management procedures and by maintaining all required CACFP records, which include financial records. To translate that to actions, this means that to meet performance standards, sponsors must hire qualified financial staff, ensure that your organization has sufficient financial resources to run CACFP smoothly, have a written financial management procedure detailing out how you are tracking your CACFP funds and expenses, submit an annual budget showing how you plan to spend your reimbursements, and save all supporting documentation for your income and expenses for CACFP. Supporting documentation may include claim reimbursement documentation, bank statements, food receipts, non-food receipts, invoices, time distribution reports, payroll records, utility bills, cost allocation documentation, mileage logs, and profit and loss reports. There may be additional documentation that must be saved depending on the expenses approved on your budget. All sponsors will need to save claim reimbursement documentation, bank statements, food receipts, and a profit and loss statement or some type of account balance report at a minimum. Why do we make such a big deal about performance standards? They are important because the performance standards are in place to support nonprofit food service. Nonprofit food service is the guiding principle for CACFP financial management. It means that food service operations conducted by the organization are principally for the benefit of the participants, and all CACFP reimbursement funds are used solely for the operations and improvements of the program. Nonprofit food service, or NPFS in other words, means that all the CACFP reimbursements you receive goes into paying for food, operational labor, administrative labor, monitoring, and/or delivery. Nonprofit food service is a method of documenting fiscal accountability of CACFP funds by tracking CACFP revenue and expenses separately from organizational revenue and expenses to ensure CACFP funds are used solely for the operation and improvement of the CACFP. How can you tell if you are running a nonprofit food service each month? It is not enough to say, I earned $5,000 from CACFP reimbursements this month, and I think I spent $5,500, so I am running a nonprofit food service. You cannot simply estimate or guess. Instead, you need to account for all CACFP income and expenses separately from other organizational income and expenses, or by setting up a CACFP fund account, or creating CACFP income and expense accounts supported by the chart of accounts. Either option is fine if the system used tracks CACFP income, CACFP expenses, and the CACFP account balance each month. Sponsors that are unable to track CACFP income and expenses separately from organizational expenses in their accounting system may use the ODE-CMP developed Food Program Expense Report. The tool is available on the CACFP Resources page. In summary, the requirement is that you have a system in place that supports CACFP income was used solely on allowable CACFP expenses, and any unspent income is retained for future CACFP expenses. When we say allowable CACFP expenses, it means that these are costs that are included on the approved CACFP budget and can be paid for using CACFP funds. These are necessary and reasonable costs that support the goals of CACFP. Food, non-food supplies, and food service labor costs typically account for the majority or all of the CACFP reimbursement. For most sponsors, these will be the only expenses that will be charged. For some sponsors, it can include purchases of vended meals, the use of a food service management company, capital equipment purchases, and contracted services such as bookkeeping or registered dietitian services. These must be submitted to ODE-CMP for specific prior written approval. Specific prior written approval means that you must request and receive approval for both the cost and the amount in writing from ODE-CMP. This is in addition to the overall budget approval. All costs charged to the CACFP, including those requiring specific prior written approval, must be approved by ODE-CMP through the annual budget. When we talk about supporting documentation, this will be needed for all CACFP income and all expenses that are charged to CACFP funds. We had looked at these documentation previously when we discussed actions required to meet performance standards. Remember that only expenses supported by documentation will be allowable. Think about the expenses you charge to your CACFP account. And if you're not sure, take a look at your CACFP budget and see what expenses are approved. Which of these documentation would you need to save? Everyone will need to have claim reimbursement documentation, bank statements, food receipts, and a profit and loss report. Think about your own situation. What other documentation do you need to save based on the approved CACFP costs on your CACFP budget? As a best practice, consult with your accountant on appropriate supporting documentation for your situation. The whole reason why you need a dedicated CACFP fund account is to make it easier to understand your monthly and annual account balance for CACFP. If you have a positive account balance, it means that there is money left over after all the allowable CACFP expenses were paid, and that additional CACFP funds left over must be spent on allowable CACFP expenses you have, or by improving the CACFP through buying better products or improving services. A negative account balance means that your allowable CACFP expenses has exceeded the CACFP income you earned from reimbursable meals. When this happens, you must have other organizational funds to pay for these expenses. We are finding that the CACFP reimbursement does not cover all costs incurred to operate the CACFP, so having a sufficient amount of unrestricted funds available is important to ensure financial viability and that you can continue to operate the CACFP. Remember that all expenses charged to the CACFP MPFS account must have supporting documentation, and that documentation will vary depending on what you have approved on your budget. At a minimum though, you will need to have food costs, and that is because as a food program, regulations require that food costs will make up a minimum of 50% of your CACFP reimbursements. In addition, administrative costs must not exceed 15% of CACFP reimbursements. This means that if you have administrative labor costs or mileage costs, you can't charge more than 15% of the reimbursements you receive. A sponsor who receives $1,000 a month in reimbursements will only be able to charge up to $150 of it to administrative costs. If that sponsor has a food program coordinator who works 10 hours a month on CACFP duties like claiming and completing paperwork, This will likely exceed $150 of labor cost. So that additional cost will be considered unfunded and unallowable CACFP costs. Remember that all costs charged must be actual costs incurred. Unfunded costs are those that exceed CACFP reimbursements. These will still need to be listed on the budget, but with minimal detail and no supporting documentations are required. Unallowable CACFP costs are those that cannot be charged to the CACFP account. Our example of admin labor exceeding $150 is an example of both an unfunded and unallowable expense after the first $150. The sponsor will need to make sure that there are additional unrestricted funding to cover the cost of the food program coordinator's time to complete CACFP duties. Let's think about your program now and how you can maintain a nonprofit food service account. A nonprofit food service account is a method of documenting fiscal accountability of CACFP funds required by USDA. It requires CACFP income and expenses to be tracked separately from organizational income and expenses, that only allowable expenses be charged, and that any excess reimbursement over expenses is retained and only used for CACFP expenses. Maintaining nonprofit food service requires a system to be in place. The parts of the system include an accounting system that is set up to track CACFP revenue and expenses, a CACFP budget to identify allowable CACFP expenses, anticipated CACFP revenue, and other organizational revenue sources that will be available to cover all CACFP expenses, whether allowable or unallowable, written NPFS policies and procedures to document fiscal accountability and compliance with CACFP regulations, and a CACFP management plan that provides a high-level overview of your organization's written practices and procedures and demonstrates how the CACFP will be managed. We'll divide our discussion of NPFS into 4 sections and start with looking at the big picture. When we think about financial oversight and all the required duties as part of managing this part of CACFP, we can think of it as a cycle that repeats multiple times a year for some actions and once a year for others. New sponsors and renewing sponsors will always start with creating a budget. For renewing sponsors, this occurs in August of each year. This budget is an estimate of the anticipated reimbursements they will receive from ODE, and then what they plan to spend those reimbursements on. Renewing sponsors should obtain historical information for CACFP operations from the prior year as a baseline for their annual CACFP budget. Actual revenue and expenditure from the prior year should be the starting point for the current year budget. The budget is approved by ODE-CMP after a review process, and then throughout the year, sponsors purchase food and other supplies needed to operate the program. Sponsors will need to maintain source documents to support all expenses charged to CACFP funds. Monthly expenses should be reviewed to the budget by completing a budget to actual comparison. If the actual income and expenses are significantly different than the estimated income or expenses on the budget, sponsors should reassess the budget and seek technical assistance from ODE-CMP to identify if a budget revision is necessary. This part of the cycle repeats monthly. Anytime there is a significant change to your budget, a budget revision request must be sent to ODE-CMP. Significant changes may be due to situations such as adding or removing a site, going from self-operating to vended, or a significant change in staffing, or if you're adding or needing to add a new expense category, or the amount budgeted for an expense category increases more than 10%. Prior approval is required, so any new costs may not be incurred or charged to CACFP prior to receiving budget approval from ODE-CMP. The financial oversight cycle may vary for sponsors based on size and staffing, but all of these actions will be undertaken by all sponsors throughout each year. Part of understanding the big picture of financial management is also knowing who will be in charge of managing it and identifying staff positions that will have a role in maintaining nonprofit food service. On this slide is a list of the main financial management duties. This is also listed out on page 16 of the workbook. Take a minute and look at these tasks and write in the titles of the staff who completes these procedures for your organization. Who oversees your financial management? Is it your director? Is it your CFO? This should be the person who understands the purpose of CACFP and can make decisions on hiring and large purchases. Who tracks your CACFP income and expenses? These tasks are part of the financial oversight cycle that must be done day to day or month to month. Do you have an accounting team responsible for this? Is this part of your food program coordinator's duties? Who maintains food and labor costs? This is the person assessing your budget and seeing if you need to make some changes or stay the course with your spending. Is it the financial office contact? Is it the director? Who writes and updates your nonprofit food service procedures? Is it your food program coordinator? Is it your authorized representative? And who completes your monthly claims? This one varies quite a bit from sponsor to sponsor, but some common staff titles include accounting technician and a food program coordinator. Who purchases and prepares the food? There may be several staff involved with these tasks. Write in all of their titles, for example, cook, food program coordinator, assistant director, or others. Who creates the annual budget? This will likely be the same person who maintains food and labor costs or someone who works closely with them. Who maintains receipts and invoices? Is this the same staff who tracks CACFP income and expenses? Does it go through multiple departments? And for all of these tasks, do you have backup staff who can take over if the regular staff is out for a period of time? We know that some organizations are running a lean ship with limited staffing. In these situations, it's even more important to have a backup emergency plan in place. Do you have your procedures written down somewhere for other trained staff to follow in case you are out for a prolonged period of time? If not, how will your organization make sure they are meeting CACFP performance standards? Once you have a sense of the big picture, the next step is to set up a good tracking system. How will you track your nonprofit food service account? Take a minute to think about your own system and how you are currently tracking your CACFP finances. Do you know if you have a way to generate a monthly profit and loss report for CACFP? Are you able to track the amount you receive from CACFP reimbursements and then compare that to the amount you spend in CACFP expenses? Are you able to track the balance of your CACFP account monthly and cumulatively? Hopefully the answer is yes. Many sponsors use accounting software that makes it easy to set up a separate fund account for CACFP. However, if you are not sure or you feel that your system is not quite adequate, the answer is to create a fund account to track CACFP revenue and expenses separately from other organizational revenue and expenses, or create sub-accounts supported by this chart of accounts so that CACFP revenue and expenses can be easily identified and the balance of unspent CACFP funds can be identified. ODE-CMP has created a food program expense report on the ODE-CMP CACFP resources page for sponsors who don't have the ability to track CACFP revenue and expenses separately from other organizational income and expenses. It is important to note the ODE-CMP expense report alone is not sufficient to support documentation of a nonprofit food service account. This is just a tool to help sponsors organize nonprofit food service income and expenses and track the account balance. It is not a financial management system. Financial records from the accounting system are required to support entries on the expense report. With a tracking system in place, the next step is to figure out the expenses that you are approved to charge to your nonprofit food service account. Look at your current approved CACFP budget and see if the approved expenses match with the expenses you are currently charging to your CACFP fund account. These are divided up into operating expenses and administrative expenses. Remember that administrative expenses must be limited to 15% of your reimbursement. For most sponsors, food costs, food service supply costs, and operating labor costs will be the only costs charged to the CACFP account, as these costs likely will absorb the CACFP reimbursement. Per 2 CFR Part 200, federal funds expended must be accounted for in accordance with state laws and procedures, and supporting documentation must be maintained for all costs incurred documenting compliance with regulations. We have already mentioned supporting documentation earlier, and hopefully you have started to think about what documents you are currently keeping. Review page 19 of the workbook and check off the documents that you save or write in alternative documentation if the checkboxes don't apply. Everyone will have food receipts since the CACFP is a food program. ODE-CMP requires that food costs be prioritized so that a minimum of 50% of the reimbursements earned each month will be expended on food. Most sponsors charge operational labor for their cook's time. This will require several source documents. Timesheets must be maintained and must identify total time worked, not just time spent on CACFP activities. Time distribution reports are required for staff that complete CACFP and non-CACFP duties to establish the portion of labor costs that may be charged to CACFP. Payroll records must be maintained to support the compensation paid to staff, including deductions and taxes. Both food receipts and timesheets are considered CACFP purchases. There are other types of documentation that may be required depending on the expenses incurred, such as documentation of donated foods received, utility bills, and billing statements for contracted services and agreements. Since we are reviewing CACFP funds from receipt to purchase to payment, we also need to ensure all expenses incurred and supported by an invoice or receipt have been paid. Most sponsors will have canceled checks, credit card statements, payroll records, and digital transactions. If you made a purchase via a credit card, ODE-CMP will want to see the statements. It is a good idea to use a business credit card to help separate out business expenses from personal purchases you may have. This is also a good practice since late fees and interest cannot be charged to the CACFP nonprofit food service account since these are expressly unallowable costs. Payroll records are also needed if you charge labor costs to support that your staff were paid, and digital transactions can support that electronic payments were also paid. Finally, everyone will need to make sure that they have a bank statement showing that all costs were paid in full. We have focused a lot on charged expenses to the CACFP account, but let's discuss uncharged or unfunded CACFP expenses. When we say charged, we mean allowable CACFP expenses charged to the nonprofit food service account. Sometimes you may have expenses that you incurred due to running the CACFP, but you either can't charge them to the CACFP account or the reimbursement may not be sufficient to cover all expenses incurred. Some expenses are just not allowable due to USDA requirements. For example, you may have a lot of administrative labor costs, especially if you are a new CACFP sponsor learning about the program and setting up your policies and procedures. However, you can only charge up to 15% of your reimbursements, as we mentioned earlier. So any administrative costs incurred that amount to more than 15% of the reimbursement are unallowable. Another example of unallowable costs would be missing documentation supporting the expense. Your food purchaser lost the receipt to last week's grocery run and you don't have a way to get another receipt. In that case, you will end up not charging those costs to the CACFP account and pay for that using other funds. What we see most often is unfunded CACFP expenses. These are costs incurred to run the program that exceed the CACFP reimbursement earned. Unfunded costs may be treated in one of two ways. You can choose to charge all CACFP costs to the CACFP account, knowing that you will have a negative account balance and need to complete a journal entry or transfer of funds to cover the excess costs with other organizational funds, or you can choose not to charge the excess costs to the CACFP account. What are some of the benefits to either option? If you charge all costs to the CACFP account, you will have an accurate reflection of how much it actually costs to run this program. And this will help your organization make business decisions about the program and identify how much it will cost each month to pay unfunded costs. This is a suggested option if you have a strong financial system in place and sufficient staff to maintain supporting documentation. On the other hand, if you are a small organization with limited financial staff, choosing to only charge certain CACFP cost categories to the CACFP may be a more manageable option. It is a personal preference based on organizational need. Both options are acceptable with ODE-CNP as long as you can document that your CACFP reimbursements are being used entirely for CACFP expenses. The expenses charged to CACFP are included in the approved CACFP budget, and the CACFP costs charged are sufficient to absorb the reimbursement. We will touch on allocated costs briefly, since most sponsors do not charge allocated costs. These are expenses that cannot be charged entirely to CACFP because they are shared between programs. Think of utilities like water or electricity, where you often have one bill, but the costs benefit all operations of the organization. For sponsors who choose to charge allocated costs to CACFP funds, they will need to submit documentation to ODE-CNP of the allocation method and the percentage to be allocated. The allocation must be identified on the CACFP budget and receive approval prior to charging allocated costs to CACFP. Allocation methods will vary based on the expenses that are allocated, but in all cases, the allocation must be based on the benefits received, not the source of funds available to pay for the cost. ODE-CNP's annual budget spreadsheet has a formula built in to identify the allowable percentage that may be charged to CACFP for rent or utilities. Let's finish up our expenses section with a discussion on unallowable costs. There's some overlap with uncharged and unfunded expenses, but unallowable costs are those that expressly cannot be charged to CACFP. This includes all costs that do not support CACFP, also known as non-program costs, costs not approved on the budget, costs that are not properly documented, admin costs over 15% of reimbursement, licensing fees, general business expenses such as daycare licenses, fundraising costs, improvements of facilities, bad debts, fines, and late charges, as well as tips and gratuities. During reviews, ODE-CMP commonly finds unallowable costs when commingled purchases are made. This is when program and non-program items are purchased together and are on one receipt. There are 3 situations with unallowable costs on your CACFP Financial Management Workbook. But let's focus on situation 1, which is a very common issue. You have non-program costs commingled with CACFP costs on a grocery receipt when your staff purchase coffee and tea for the break room, along with all the rest of your CACFP food supplies. What system do you have in place to make sure that the coffee and tea are not charged to the CACFP nonprofit food service account? You can write down a short synopsis of your procedure for disallowing unallowable items on a food receipt in your workbook. Here's an example of a best practice for a written procedure for this situation. For our example, the food program coordinator will go through all food receipts on a weekly basis and highlight the non-allowable or non-program costs on the receipt and write in a new total for allowable expenses only, along with their initial. The authorized representative will be the backup for this task if the food program coordinator is not available. The receipts will be provided to the financial office contact, who will add the new receipt total to the CACFP nonprofit food service account as an expense on a monthly basis. The authorized representative will be the backup for this task if the financial office contact is not available. So to confirm the process shown meets the who, what, and how for developing a written procedure for this task, you have the who with the backups, which is very important, the food program coordinator, authorized representative, and the financial office contact, the what, which is disallowing unallowable items on the food receipts, and the how, highlighting receipts and adding a new total that can be charged to the CACFP account. Your procedure does not have to be complicated. It can be 1 or 2 paragraphs and look different than this example. The only requirement is to clearly define what will be done. Now that we have finished with our expenses, we'll look at tracking CACFP income, which is often much simpler. Monthly CACFP reimbursements will be the main source of CACFP income for all sponsors. If you don't know how much you received in reimbursements, you can find this information in CNP Web on the Claims tab and the Payments tab. The Claims tab will provide you with the amount you received for each month, and the Payments tab provides you with the payments sent to your organization during the fiscal year, including any adjustments that needed to be made. Sponsors may have other funding sources, such as parent payments for CACFP pricing programs, where you charge above-scale eligible or reduced-price eligible families for meals, or potentially income from vending meals to other CACFP sponsors. And in some cases, when donations are received for the CACFP. All of these different sources of funding should be totaled to identify the annual CACFP revenue. Once you know both your CACFP income and expenses, you can finally determine if you are meeting nonprofit food service requirements by calculating your account balance. ODE-CMP requires that sponsors are able to determine their CACFP nonprofit food service account on a monthly and annual basis. Sponsors with an accounting system that is set up to track CACFP revenue and expenses separately from other sources of revenue and expenses should be able to generate a profit and loss statement for any time period that is needed. Sponsors without a way to track CACFP separately from other organizational funds may use the ODE-CMP Food Program Expense Report to determine their monthly balances, or you can create your own template. The spreadsheet is downloadable from the CACFP Resources page. In situations where sponsors have a positive account balance, meaning that not all CACFP reimbursements have been spent on CACFP expenses, you will want to make sure that all allowable expenses per the approved budget were charged to your CACFP account, especially if you have expenses that you decided not to charge. This may mean requesting a budget revision and getting it approved by ODE-CMP. In situations where sponsors have a positive account balance after charging all cost categories on the approved budget, you will want to reach out to your assigned specialist for technical assistance on ways to use CACFP funds to improve the CACFP meal service. In situations where you still have a positive account balance after all allowable expenses have been charged, you must retain the excess funds for future expenses and evaluate the expenses charged to identify if there are additional costs that could be charged to CACFP. Sponsors with a CACFP balance that is equal to or greater than the average of 3 months of CACFP expenses must contact their assigned specialist to develop a spend-down plan. This is where you tell ODE-CMP what you would like to purchase to improve the quality of your program. This can include new kitchen equipment, buying different foods such as a greater variety of fruits and vegetables, or adding in an occasional seafood protein, or hiring additional CACFP staff to do more from-scratch cooking. However, more often we see that sponsors will incur more expenses than are covered by the CACFP reimbursement and have a negative account balance before transferring other funds or completing a journal entry to cover the expenses that exceed the reimbursement. When completing the CACFP budget, all sponsors are required to identify the source and amount of unrestricted funds available to cover a negative CACFP balance. Insufficient unrestricted funds may imply that the sponsor is unable to pay debts and has diminished financial viability, which is one of the performance standards that sponsors must meet. Ultimately, the goal of nonprofit food service is to show that all the CACFP income received is being spent on allowable CACFP expenses, and that any excess reimbursement over expenses is retained and only used for CACFP expenses and the improvement of the CACFP. If you typically have excess CACFP income each month, you will want to contact your assigned specialist to receive technical assistance on allowable expenses and improvements to the CACFP operations. If you typically have a negative account balance each month, you will want to ensure that you have sufficient unrestricted funding that can cover the cost of operating the CACFP program. Once you have a tracking system in place and you are able to determine a monthly and annual accounting report of your CACFP fund account, completing an annual budget will be easier since you will have historical CACFP revenue and expense data. The budget identifies projected CACFP income and CACFP expenses for the upcoming year based on historical data and anticipated changes. Once you have a CACFP nonprofit food service account set up, simply pull your profit and loss reports for the year and then update your budget based on this information along with any knowledge you may have of upcoming changes such as staff raises, contract changes, or rate increases. New sponsors may use Appendix A on the Excel budget spreadsheet to determine an estimated reimbursement based on enrolled participants and the percentage of participants that qualify as free, reduced price, and above scale. If you would like more in-depth guidance on how to create your budget, ODE-CMP has a budget guidance and procedures tool on our CACFP resources page with step-by-step guidance on completing the budget. Before you start your budget though, take a look at the budget checklist on page 25 of the workbook and make sure you have all of the people and materials needed to complete your budget successfully. First, you want to make sure that you have at least 2 responsible principals involved. Responsible principals are the authorized representative, food program coordinator, and financial office contacts listed in CNP Web. The first will be the person who will complete the budget, and the second will be the person who will review that budget and act as a double check to verify that the information is correct. Both the responsible principals must be sponsor staff, so an outside bookkeeper or food service management company staff cannot work on the budget. It does have to be 2 different people, so sponsors with a small but mighty crew will want to make sure they have a second person who is knowledgeable enough to review the budget and sign off on it. Having 2 different people helps to ensure that all information is accurate and reinforces program integrity before ODE-CMP reviews the budget. Next, make sure that both responsible principals are reviewing the 3 main resources that we have for the budget. Both of them will need to check that they have reviewed the Budget Guidance Procedures, the FNS Instruction 796-2 Revision 4, and the USDA Guidance for Management Plans and Budgets. These are resources with a vast amount of information, and not all of the information will apply to all programs. You do not need to read through the entire resource, but instead, review the table of contents if there is one, and focus on the sections that will apply to your situation. For example, if you are only charging food expenses to your account, and you only serve CACFP meals at your site, you can safely skip the allocation sections for FNS 796. Finally, make sure that you have all the data that you will need. This includes your projected CACFP income for the upcoming fiscal year. Think about whether you will be adding sites or expanding enrollment, what unrestricted funds you will have available in case you have a negative balance, what operational expenses and general costs will you have for CACFP? Are you switching to vended meals at a site? Are you planning on hiring another cook? And finally, think about your administrative expense and costs. Have you charged administrative expenses in your previous budget? Do you need to start charging administrative expenses? Once you have all of this ready, you can begin to work on your budget. Keep in mind that if you have any substantial changes to your program mid-year, such as changing the number of sites you have or switching from vended to self-operation or vice versa, you must submit a revised budget to ODE-CMP for approval. Where does the management plan and the financial management procedure fit in with all of this? Both of these are also required to be completed by all CACFP sponsors, and they help ODE-CMP to better understand how sponsors are managing their CACFP nonprofit food service accounts. A management plan is a summary of your organization's written practices and procedures. It demonstrates your organization's ability to manage CACFP operations and meet the CACFP performance standards. This is required information, and sponsors complete the online management plan in CNP Web under their Applications tab. The financial management procedure is required as part of the CACFP performance standards on program accountability. Sponsors are required to have a detailed written procedure covering how they manage their CACFP nonprofit food service account. Essentially, you need to write out how you are going to implement all the steps we have gone over with tracking CACFP income and expenses. Both the management plan and the financial management procedure work together to provide a full picture of your financial management practices. Consistency is key, especially when information is provided on multiple documents. We want you to provide us with accurate and up-to-date information, so you will want to make sure that the information you provide in your annual budget matches with the information you have in your management plan and financial management procedure. Anytime you update one of the documents, you must update the others if there are information that overlap with each other. This is important because ODE-CMP compares all these documents with each other when we review your application during renewals and when we are on site during an administrative review. In all cases, we want to make sure that the information matches with your current practices. Most sponsors are very familiar with the management plan since it's a required application and part of the CACFP renewal process. Sponsors are required to update their management plan each year to complete renewals. In addition to renewals, if there are staffing changes or operational changes during the year, sponsors must also update the management plan since it is a living document that reflects current big picture CACFP practices for your organization. The CACFP Financial Management Workbook includes questions from the management plan related to nonprofit food service, and we went over some of these questions in our big picture section earlier. The workbook also provides some additional guidance on how to fill out the management plan. Completing the management plan section on the workbook can guide sponsors as they create their financial management plan. Again, it is important that your budget, your management plan, and your written financial management procedure all align with each other to ensure that your operations are running smoothly and that everyone at your organization is on the same page regarding CACFP duties. The CACFP Financial Management Procedure expands on your management plan. The written procedure is required as part of Performance Standard 3, Program Accountability. Sponsors do not have to create a written procedure from scratch. ODE-CMP has two different templates for financial management. One is in a narrative style that is free form and allows sponsors to provide detailed paragraphs of explanations. This is in a Microsoft Word document and can be downloaded from our CACFP resources page. For sponsors who prefer more of a question and answer format, ODE-CMP also has a fill-in procedure template where more specific questions are asked and sponsors can fill in with shorter answers. The file is in Adobe PDF, which may be helpful for sponsors who have trouble with accessing Microsoft Suites. We have this version available in the Financial Management Workbook, and it's also available as a standalone file. If neither of those templates work for you, or you already have an organizational template you need to use, you are always welcome to create your own procedure. If you are using your own template, make sure that you are addressing all of the required information. Specifically, that you are answering the questions regarding how fiscal integrity of all CACFP funds are being maintained, what your process is to ensure accountability of all expenses, how is your organization ensuring program funds are only used for authorized CACFP purposes, what safeguards do you have in place to prevent improper financial activities, and how do you ensure CACFP administrative costs do not exceed regulatory limits? Our templates include all of these topics, so feel free to borrow from our templates as well, or just adopt one of them to use. Your written financial management procedure, no matter what template is used, must provide an accurate view of your current practices. A written procedure must be on file, either electronically or on paper, and be available to ODE-CMP staff when requested. ODE-CMP staff will review all financial management procedures during administrative reviews and on other occasions as needed. During the administrative review, ODE staff is checking to ensure that sponsors are following the written procedures that they have. Written procedures should not be written and then stored away to be forgotten until the next time ODE asks for the document. It is a living document and should be updated every time there is a change in your internal process. This may be due to staffing changes, timeline shifts, or other procedural changes. Whenever this happens, make sure to update your written financial management procedure as well. Every time you update your written financial management procedure, it is helpful to check the following. Did you need to update your management plan and budget as well? Sometimes your updates are minor and your management plan and budget won't be affected. But other times, you have major shifts within your organization and it will impact both. Did you double check and verify that the fiscal responsibilities as listed in your written procedure match with the actual responsibilities for your staff? Is the written procedure accurate, and do you fully understand and account for all expenses that are and have been charged to your CACFP nonprofit food service account and are approved on the budget? Are timelines for tracking and reporting transactions accurate? Are all documents saved in the right files by staff? Is everyone saving them in the same location? Let's do a quick walkthrough of the financial management procedure in your workbook. The procedure is divided into 3 main sections. Section 1 is on the record process and timeline. This will be the bulk of your written procedure. The second section is a 1-pager, which details where all your documents are kept. And the third and final section is on resources you used and reviewed to complete this procedure. The record process and timeline section of the procedure template includes 4 subsections: overview, operating expenses, administrative expenses, and determining nonprofit food service. We are not going to go over each subsection in detail, but we will cover some examples. The page number is listed on the slide on the top right, so you can follow along if you have the workbook open. Our first example is under the Overview subsection under Part 2, Allowable and Unallowable Expenses. On the slide, we have an example of how a sponsor can answer the question, how are allowable and unallowable expenses determined? The answers do not have to be very long, as our example's answer shows us. Only expenses approved on the CACFP annual budget will be considered allowable. This includes CACFP food expenses, non-food expenses, and operating labor costs for the cook only. All other expenses will be unallowable. For your own answer, check your most recently approved budget and see what expenses have been approved. Our next example is on allocated costs. While most sponsors won't have any allocated costs, we wanted to provide you with an example of how you would document allocated costs in your written procedure. In this example, the electricity bill is the cost with a 25% approved percentage. This is determined based on the time and space usage of the kitchen per the approved budget. Like our last example, it's always helpful to link your answer to the approved budget for CACFP expenses. Next, let's look at an example of an operating expense. Everyone will have food expenses, so make sure you are listing the staff who will be responsible for tracking these expenses and list in the rightmost column the time frame the staff will have to complete entering these expenses. And looking at administrative expenses, you can see there's a box to check at the top of Part C. Anytime you see the not applicable check mark, you know that there is a section that won't apply to all sponsors, and depending on how you are managing your CACFP finances, might be a section that won't apply to you. In contrast, if there's no not applicable check mark, you will have to fill out that section. Let's look at determining nonprofit food service now. This is under Part D, Table 1 on Income Verification. If you operate any other child nutrition programs, you will want to check Yes for Question D and list the program below. Most CACFP sponsors who operate other child nutrition programs will be operating SFSP if you are not a school district. If you answer yes to Question D, you must answer question E and provide a short explanation for how you ensure the income expenses for both programs are documented. In this example, there are different account codes for CACFP and SFSP income and expenses. The account codes can be used to pull profit and loss reports to determine non-profit food service for each program. It's also important for all sponsors to complete the table on verifying 50% of reimbursement is spent on food expenses. While there's not only a single way to verify that at least 50% of your reimbursement is used for food, the example provides a simple way to do so. In this example, the manager submits the claim monthly and then submits the amount paid by ODE to their director. The director will verify all CACFP expenses by category, in this case food, non-food, and labor for the month. The food expenses are totaled and divided by the claim payment received for the month. If that number is at least 0.5 or above, or 50% and above, then this requirement will be met. Let's move further along the procedure to the table on closing the claim month. We'll take a look at questions D through H. These questions have to do with the profit and loss report and the staff who are responsible for determining whether non-profit food service is met. Question D asks, who is responsible for reviewing it? When reviewing, the goal is to see if you have a positive or negative account balance. In our example, it will be the director who is responsible. We find that it is most helpful when a director or authorized representative who has managerial oversight is the one who reviews this information. Question E then asks, who is the staff that determines whether funds must be transferred or a journal entry must be completed? A journal entry is a record of business transaction that details accounts and balances. All journal entries must include the date, amount credited or debited, and a brief description of the accounts affected and reason for the entry. In our example, the Chief Financial Officer is responsible, but this can be any staff who balances your books or does your accounting. Question F asks for a backup for this role. Question G follows up to see who completes that transfer or journal entry. This can be the same person as E, but it does not have to be. Question H is also asking for another backup. The backup should be another staff, since the purpose is to make sure someone else can jump in if the initial staff is not available. In Table 5, Year-End Reconciliation, we have a question on the spend down plan. This doesn't happen very often, but it occurs when sponsors have a very large positive account balance at the end of their fiscal year. If a sponsor has more than 3 months of operating expenses, a spend down plan must be submitted to ODE CMP. You do not have to write a spend down plan in your procedure, but you do have to identify who would write it if the situation ever happens. In our example, the nutrition coordinator and the director are both assigned to this task if it ever occurs. Please heed the note that all spend down plans must be approved first by ODE CMP before you start your spending. Most smaller sponsors will find that CACFP funds do not cover all costs associated with CACFP. In these cases, make sure you have that unrestricted fund available. Question G in the same table asks for the funding source. Again, double check with your budget, this time under the Summary tab, and make sure that your response is the same. If your unrestricted funding source has changed, make sure to update your budget. All in all, the goal of the written procedure is to ensure that any of your staff can use the procedure to pick up where someone else left off, and still make sure that all CACFP financial management requirements are being met. The procedure must match with your actual practices on site, otherwise it doesn't have much value as a procedure. And the procedures must allow any internal or external reviewers to determine whether you are meeting CACFP financial management requirements or not. In review, we started off with the learning objectives for this training, and hopefully you now have a comprehensive understanding of how financial management is implemented and tracked in CACFP, and you are now able to create a financial management procedure for your organization that meets all CACFP nonprofit food service requirements. We also went over Financial Management 101 in the CACFP. We discussed performance standards that must be met by all sponsors, what nonprofit food service actually is, and we went into detail about why it is necessary to meet nonprofit food service and how that can be implemented in your own organization. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to your assigned child nutrition specialist. Before we end our training, here's a short message from the Oregon Department of Education. ODE supports equity and excellence for every learner and seeks to work with school districts, educational service districts, and community partners like you. We believe all children should have access to a high-quality, well-rounded learning experience. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. Thank you for taking this ODE CMP financial management training.